Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about the fourth album from Rumpistol with Red Baron, Floating. Okay, so after reaching what I believe to be the peak of his core style on Dynamo, Rumpistol decided that it was time to try some new things, branch out his style into new territory. This first manifested in an EP from 2011 called Talk to You, which I was directly asked to discuss by the guy who requested this series. Is probably important to talk about for this album anyway. See, this EP was special not because it has one of the most overtly frightening album covers I've ever seen, and I absolutely hate looking at it, but it was primarily billed as his first time including vocals in his music. I mean, his debut had spoken vocal samples included in various segments, but this was the first time in which the main hooks of his tracks were carried by sung vocals. That said, I think this announcement of a groundbreaking new development in the Rumpistol sound might be a bit overstated, because the vocals on the Talk to You EP still very much sound like samples. Not to mention, the way that these samples are manipulated reminds me very heavily of one artist in particular, Burial. I heard the title track on this thing and the pitched down samples of "Wanna talk to you, wanna talk to you" immediately brought to mind "Holding you, let it be alone, let it be alone, let it be alone." The influence was really obvious, and all 5 tracks on the EP basically sounded like a collab between Rumpistol and Burial, which, is cool, and the EP was well produced and created plenty of nice, spooky atmosphere that could effectively work as this guy's take on the sounds of Untrue. Not particularly original or giving me much to discuss. But this EP has to be mentioned in the context of this fourth album, because the actual track, Talk to You, reappears on this project. The second track to be exact, and in a new form, because as you can tell from the fact that this project is billed as a collab, Rumpistol delivers on the promise of that EP in a much more direct way, which brings us to the other artist marked as a direct collaborator, a singer by the name of Tobias Buch Anderson, aka Red Baron. I'm not particularly familiar with Red Baron's work, but from what I can tell, his work with Rumpistol here is probably the highest profile thing he's been attached to. And the version of Talk to You that appears here does not have the vocal samples from the original, but rather Red Baron singing an imitation of said samples. Which, yeah, that's actually pretty cool, and a much more original take on this idea. Also, the instrumental is much glitchier and more easily recognizable as Rumpistol style. I mean, the title track was probably the best track on the Talk to You EP. I'm all for seeing it in this form on this album. But of course, one track does not necessarily an album make, and the whole Floating album in full is actually a big mixed bag that doesn't really come together as a complete piece very well. It was probably the project of Rumpistol's that felt like it gave me the most to say on first listen. The others I had to listen to quite a few times in order to be able to put my feelings into words, and this one, right from first listen, I knew how I felt and what I wanted to say about it. But, that doesn't necessarily translate to this project being any better or worse than the others. I mean, it's generally fine, but some tracks definitely do more for me than others. So I guess before I get into individual tracks, I need to talk about Red Baron's singing in particular. He's a pretty good singer. I don't mind his presence. But there's no way around the fact that this guy is a total dead ringer for Thom Yorke. I mean, I suppose if I listen hard enough, I can tell the difference between the two. I think Red Baron's voice is a little weaker, wavers more, and Rumpistol's trying to do more modulation and glitching on his vocals, perhaps inspired by James Blake. But I could only ever hear this guy singing and think, boy, this guy sounds just like Thom Yorke. It was actually really distracting, much like hearing the on-the-nose Burial influences on the Talk to You EP. It was just something always on the forefront of my mind on so many tracks I just couldn't ignore. Especially on tracks like The World Keeps on Turning, where Red Baron's voice is just front and center and commanding your attention. That was kind of an underwhelming closer, by the way. It also didn't really help that Rumpistol's instrumentals often weren't that far cry from those on The Eraser or Anima. Especially moments on here like the title track and Anywhere. I could almost ignore it on the track Talk to You because I already knew the tune from when I heard the EP. But yeah, this obvious derivativeness running through everything was once again my biggest problem with this project. Oh yeah, and the burial influences are still here too. But at least in this case, it feels like Rumpistol is doing a better job of combining those garage and two-step sounds with his own style. He doesn't just sound like he's just straight ripping off burial here. He's bringing a lot of his usually textured and instrumentally dense style of sound design to these kinds of rhythms. Like, you can hear it on something like I'm Not Listening. The percussion totally sounds like, Archangel again. Though the synth textures on top sound like the stuff Rumpistol was just doing on Dynamo with all the layers of bleeping synths and plucking guitars. Colors Breaking is another good example of that too, where he pitches down Red Baron's voice and makes him sound more like a soul sample than a featured singer. So that was pretty neat. And it's also worth noting that not every track prominently features Red Baron in its vocals, so I am given a break from that obvious derivativeness. There's a few tracks that are more instrumental-centric, and these tend to be bigger highlights for me. Like Gravity, that filters Red Baron through this really thick auto-tune and filter, and the lumbering beat underneath that feels like it's constantly slowing down and speeding up every second. That takes more of the focus. And of course, gotta love those marimbas. Also really like how this track seems to switch up into this really strange but well-textured hip-hop-ish beat in the second half. You also got Dinosaurs, which is basically a track in the style of his Mirror Rum album, but all the layers of high-pitched plinking synths and bells and guitars here is actually pretty refreshing. But there's also quite a few interlude tracks thrown around here that don't really add that much for me. You got the ambient intro of Silver Lake, which is fine, I guess, but disappears from my head the second it's done. You got Water Mirror, which sounds like it could have been an interlude on that last Fortet album with all its various plucking sounds, albeit also with some stronger bass, but also kind of disappearing from my head once it's all done. Also, the inclusion of Howie is kind of a head-scratcher. Like, this track totally sticks out like a sore thumb. It's mainly centered around some little kid that's like 4 or 5 years old, mumbling gibberish, and filtered through autotune. The track is given some ambient synths to try and pad out the mix and attempt to make the track feel like it fits more, but yeah, I don't know, I wasn't really a fan of this one. I mean, look, as a whole, this project's certainly not bad. Even at its most obviously derivative, Rumpistol's instrumentals are certainly heavily detailed and well-balanced, and Red Baron is a good singer. But ultimately, this feels like it was designed more as an experiment to get Rumpistol out of his comfort zone than it works as a solid project in its own right. These tracks don't feel like they really complement each other that well, and the ones that do just sound like they're specifically trying to emulate someone else's sound. They're able to emulate these sounds well. These Thom Yorke ripoffs are at least good for what they are. If they had actually come from Thom Yorke, I probably wouldn't have blinked. They seem up to par with his work. But I still wish it was less obvious what they were going for. And I do also think that Rumpistol was able to juggle these same influences more successfully on his next album in a way that I think was more distinctly his own. But yeah, this project in particular, I can't really bring myself to say I think I'm gonna come back to it much. It certainly got its moments, but it's just kinda all over the place and derivative. And even the best moments on here are like on the level of the worst tracks on Dynamo. It's kind of a letdown, but I appreciate its existence if it would lead to better things down the road, so I guess take that all as you will. I'm overall feeling a 6.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.